The business leaders, the advocates, the parents, the carers, and every single person in this room who believes deeply that our workplaces, our systems, and our societies can become more inclusive than they are today. Today we're exploring business and disability, or more specifically, how do we make visible what has for too long been invisible? How do we reimagine power, participation, leadership, and design in ways that truly include all of us? That's our work for today and our responsibility as society. I love telling stories. As you get to know me, you'll know that. So I'm going to start off with one. A few years ago, I was in a boardroom. One of those meetings where the table is bigger than the actual office. I'm sure you've been in them. I had prepared. I had the data. I had the insights. I had done the work. Like so many people who live with invisible disabilities often do. We over-prepare. We double-check. We compensate. Halfway through the meeting, someone interrupted me. Not because my point was unclear, but because I wasn't visible in the way the room is conditioned to recognize authority. I realized something profound. Visibility is not just a function of skill. Visibility is a function of power. And power is often distributed in ways that exclude those whose disabilities are unseen. Those of us who are neurodivergent, autistic, chronically ill, sensory sensitive, navigating mental health challenges, recovering from trauma, or simply masking every day to survive professional spaces. Invisibility is not a disability. Invisibility is a systemic failure, and we are here today to address that failure. The reality. Across the globe, the conversation on disability is still dominated by a medical model, diagnosing, categorizing, treating, fixing, and fixing some more. And then in workplaces, the issues, they're structural, they're cultural, and they're systemic. What do I mean by this? Let's talk about structurally. The Human Rights Commission speaks of lack of accessibility, and these are the basics: ramps, lifts, adapted toilets, signage, assistive technology in the built environment of workplaces. Job design and recruitment processes that assume standard physical or mental capacity. These are like rigid job descriptions, unnecessary physical tasks, or all-day in-office presence, which exclude those with non-apparent disabilities. Organizational procedures such as benefit, leave, performance management, or disclosure procedures that are not adapted for people whose disabilities are invisible, fluctuating, or non-typical. Let's talk about culturally. Stigma, prejudice, and assumptions about disability. Example, someone with a disability can't do that job, or will give them simpler, less visible work. That sounds ridiculous being said out loud, right? But it's an underlying belief in many organizations. Secondly, invisibility and non-disclosure pressure. Many people with non-apparent disabilities don't disclose because the culture doesn't welcome difference or they fear negative consequences. We already have a leadership crisis in South Africa. Psychological safety is rare. Now add the dimension of disability to that. Tokenism or non-compliance only approaches. Companies might formally include disability, but only as a checkbox, without genuine culture change. There's lack of inclusive language. Low awareness of disability perspectives or workplace microaggressions. For example, overlooking someone's need for flexible hours or assuming someone is less able. Systemically, institutionalized policies and practices that indirectly exclude people with disabilities or disadvantage them during hiring, promotion, or retention. Power structures that determine whose voices are heard, whose expertise counts, and whose workplace participation counts, often excluding disabled people or treating them as other. Segregation of disabled workers into low-skill, low-visibility roles, or organizations failing to integrate disability inclusion into policy and strategy, rather than seeing it as a side issue. The dominance of a medical model, which I mentioned earlier, over the social rights model of disability in organizational policy, meaning disability is treated as a deficit rather than a difference, requiring system redesign. Barriers lock out or marginalize capable people with disabilities. That means talent is lost, people are excluded, and the workplace ends up less inclusive. Cultural barriers shape how people feel at work, whether they are safe, valued, visible, and able to bring their full selves. This is because systems determine resource allocation, leadership commitment, policy enforcement, data collection, and performance metrics. Unless the systemic level changes, structural and cultural improvements will be limited in effect. Let's acknowledge a few realities. Number one, disability remains largely invisible in business spaces. Most disabilities are non-apparent: ADHD, autism, ODHD, chronic pain, dyslexia, anxiety, sensory sensitivities, autoimmune conditions, just to name a few. Power dynamics decide whose voice is heard. Participation is still conditional, resulting in masking, sensory overload, and outdated work expectations. Instead of fixing people, we must fix systems that exclude them. Intersections and identities. We cannot build inclusive workplaces if we rely on single stories. Across Africa, disability sits inside layers of identity: age, race, gender, class, geography, family structure, culture, and even the body itself. An autistic teenager in South Africa experiences disability different from a male executive with dyslexia, a vendor in Zimbabwe's informal markets, a mother navigating chronic illness while raising children, a young man masking his anxiety in a factory job, or a rural woman with mobility challenges who has to travel kilometers just to access basic services. Yet, despite their different contexts, a golden thread runs through all their experiences: systems that were never built for them. We cannot speak about disability in business without speaking about social protection, access to meaningful work, rehabilitation, economic opportunity, and the reality of who is structurally left out of possibility. Many of the deepest disability experiences are embodied and unseen. Invisible illness, chronic pain, sensory overload, as I mentioned earlier, burnout, and neurodivergent masking. These shape ambition, identity, and belonging in ways our workplaces rarely acknowledge. And people with disabilities are overlooked everywhere: in academia, where intellectual authority is guarded; in business; in the informal economy, where survival is a daily negotiation; in entrepreneurship, where funding and networks are gate-kept; in corporate corridors, where power determines visibility; and in the arts, where representation is selective. Across every sphere, the pattern is the same: brilliant, capable people rendered invisible by systems that were never designed with them in mind. The discussions of today must push us to expand our imagination of power. Who gets seen? Who gets heard? Who participates? And who is overlooked? The business case for visibility and voice. So how do we think about visibility and voice? Who gets seen in business spaces? Whose ideas shape innovation? Whose needs are included in design? And whose presence is valued? Visibility is not just about being looked at. It's about being recognized, resourced, and responded to. Voice is not just about speaking. It's about being heard, legitimized, and acted upon. The business case is undeniable. Across 8 global regions, people with disabilities are employed at just 36%, compared to roughly 60% of persons without disabilities. That gap represents lost talent, lost potential, and lost economic opportunity. And globally, over 1 billion people, that's 16% of the world's population, live with at least one disability. This is not a small demographic, this is a major workforce, a major market, and a major economic force. In a global Accenture study, 76% of employees with disabilities do not fully disclose their disability at work. Among C-suite executives and their direct reports, this rises to 80%. Entire pools of talent remain unseen, not because they lack stability or ability, but because workplaces lack psychological safety and supportive infrastructure. And when people do request support, the response is equally revealing. Deloitte's global survey of 10,000 people with disabilities, chronic health conditions, or neurodivergence found that 74% had at least one accommodation request rejected, and nearly 20% had all their requests denied, every single request denied. At the same time, 57% of accommodations cost nothing, and most others require only a small one-time expense. So the barrier has never been cost. It's almost always culture, leadership, and imagination. This is why visibility matters. Because what we see, we support. What we recognize, we invest in. What we overlook, we lose. Visibility can be built in different ways across different contexts. In the ways communities and workplaces intentionally create space and opportunity for those who are often overlooked. In the stories of persistence and flourishing that show how disability can deepen creativity and strength. In the everyday acts of communication that open the door to belonging. In the reminders that our shared humanity is always the starting point. And in the leaders who choose reflection as a pathway to creating more responsive and inclusive environments. And when we expand who gets visibility, youth, neurodivergent professionals, deaf entrepreneurs, sensory sensitive workers, reflective leaders, we expand what business becomes possible. Inclusion is not charity. Inclusion is strategy. Inclusive organizational cultures and systems. Across the world, organizations are learning that culture is not shaped by intention alone. Culture is shaped by design, by systems, by human factors, and by the neuroscience of how people experience their environments. And when those systems are built without disabled people in mind, exclusion becomes automatic, even when nobody intended harm. And research into organizational culture shows that when companies only focus on visible compliance rather than lived experience, the front stage of policy remains disconnected from the backstage of actual practice. We cannot achieve inclusion without deeply rethinking the architectures that shape behavior, the systems, the technologies, communication patterns, leadership mindsets, and workplace environments that either widen or narrow access. Inclusive culture is built on multiple pillars. The first pillar is human factors and system thinking, reminding us that inclusion must be engineered into the everyday structures of work. How decisions are made, how teams operate, how environments respond to diverse sensory and cognitive needs. Another pillar is sustainable disability inclusion, showing that long-term inclusion requires ongoing investment, accountability, and alignment between policy and practice. Sustainability is not an HR project, it's an organizational strategy. Technological enablement, including the use of AI, digital tools, and social entrepreneurship to support employees with cognitive differences, demonstrating how innovation expands participation rather than replacing it. Sensory intelligence, Grounded in neuroscience, helping us understand that people do not merely work in organizations, they experience them. Lighting, noise levels, layout, pace, meetings, and communication styles all play a neurological role in inclusion. Digital inclusion strategies, ensuring that technology does not become yet another barrier. With over 1 billion people globally living with disabilities, accessible digital infrastructure is essential. Another pillar is shifting from compliance to collaboration through tools and frameworks that help organizations move beyond box ticking into co-designed lived solutions. Aligned organizational systems also remind us that culture is built on what is measured, rewarded, promoted, and normalized, and that inclusive cultures require inclusive systems. Another pillar is breaking systemic barriers. Through case studies that show how organizations can reimagine pathways to participation when they interrogate their structures honestly. Redefining DEI is the last one. We redefine DEI in ways that center disability, power, and participation, expanding beyond conventional diversity frameworks to models that truly transform organizational life. Together, these conversations illustrate a simple truth. Organizational culture is not what we say we value, it is what our systems make possible. When we align human factors, technology, neuroscience, leadership, and policy, when we shift from compliance to collaboration, when we design systems that recognize real human experience, we build organizations where disabled people are not accommodated at the edges, but included at the center. And when we do that, inclusion becomes sustainable, not because people try harder, but because the system finally supports them. When we say inclusion is strategy, we're not speaking in abstract terms. We're speaking about the very real ways that people with disabilities strengthen organizations, not in spite of their disabilities, but often because of the ways they have learned to navigate a world not built for them. People with disabilities spend their lives problem solving around systems that overlook them, environments that overwhelm them, instructions that assume sameness, and expectations that were never designed with them in mind. Some of the most ordinary things we all use today, the things we don't even think about, only exist because disabled people needed another way of moving through the world. And when these solutions arrived, they didn't stay disability solutions, they became solutions for everyone. When you design for people who've been pushed to the margins, you end up designing better for the whole world. The first example is curb cuts. I'm sure you know them. The little ramps at street corners that we push prams, suitcases, and trolleys over. Did you know that they didn't come from urban planners thinking creatively? Well, not exactly. They came from wheelchair users who fought for them because pavements weren't built with them in mind. Today, these ramps are used far more by non-disabled people than wheelchair users. What started as a fight for access reshaped how entire cities move. The second example is closed captions. Those were developed so deaf people could follow television. Now captions are everywhere, in airports, gyms, restaurants, TikTok, even Netflix when you're in bed trying not to wake someone next to you up. What was created for inclusion has become the way millions of people consume content every day. The third example is audiobooks. Audiobooks didn't begin as a trend or convenience. They were invented in the 1930s for blind readers who needed access to stories. Fast forward to today. Commuters, parents, students, and executives listen to audiobooks, an accessibility tool quietly that's become a global industry. The list is endless. There's color contrast standards, eye gaze technology, electric toothbrushes, and text messaging, just to name a few. Let's expand this to an organizational context. SAP's Autism at Work program is the first example. SAP didn't start this program for charity. They started it because autistic employees were uncovering patterns in data that neurotypical teams had missed. Autistic analysts identified subtle system issues, coding errors and inefficiencies that save the company money and improve product quality. Today, the program exists in over 9 countries because neurodivergent problem solving strengthened SAP's competitive edge. Then we have the Aeron chair. I can't even imagine what kind of office chairs we used to use before this. This is one of the most iconic office chairs ever made, the Aeron. It wasn't designed for style, believe it or not. It was designed for older adults with mobility pain. The designer started with people who needed pressure relief, joint support, and flexible seating. The Aeron chair became the gold standard in offices worldwide because it made everyone more comfortable and productive. Designing for disability created the world's most successful economic chair. Then there's dyslexic thinking and advertising and creativity. Some of the most memorable advertising campaigns have come from dyslexic creatives who process information visually and relationally. Companies started noticing that dyslexic employees ask unconventional questions, connect ideas differently, and reshape stories in ways neurotypical creatives don't. Virgin, WPP, and LinkedIn now officially recognize dyslexic thinking as a strength and a skill because the advertising and creative industries have seen again and again that different brains deliver different breakthroughs. All of these examples tell a story. When disabled people push against the limits of design, organizations evolve. When disabled people ask for better systems, everyone gets better systems. When they rethink how the world should work, we all rise. Inclusion creates innovation, not the other way around. So what could be? Let's reimagine the future. When we talk about what could be, we're not imagining a distant, perfect world. We're talking about what becomes possible when we redesign how power works in organizations and when we stop relying on people trying harder to fit into systems that were never built for them in mind. Imagine a workplace where visibility is deliberate, where participation is designed, not accidental, where disability isn't a problem to fix, but a lens that strengthens the organization and opens new ways of thinking. At the center of this future is one idea. If we want different outcomes, we must change the architecture of power. Because power is not just who sits at the top. Power is who decides what professional looks like, whose communication style is considered effective, whose body the workplace is built around, whose comfort becomes the norm, and whose needs are treated as optional. When we shift that architecture, everything else follows. Let's reimagine a future where, number one, power is shared, not centralized. In the future we're imagining, decision-making is no longer limited to a small group. People with lived experience of disability are in the room where policies are shaped, where systems are designed, and where strategies are set. Not as an afterthought, but as experts in their own right. Instead of organizations asking, how do we accommodate you? The question becomes, how do we co-design this with you? That small shift in power changes everything. Number two, workplaces are built with actual humans in mind. Think of workplaces where quiet spaces are normal. Lighting and sound can be adjusted. People don't have to fight through sensory overload to do basic tasks. Remote and hybrid work are recognized as legitimate ways of working. Meetings are designed so everyone can contribute. Documents and digital systems are accessible by default. I feel my whole nervous system rewiring when I read that. This is not just about special treatment, it's about design. When environments take a wider range of human needs seriously, everybody benefits. Number three, technology removes barriers instead of adding them. We often talk about AI or digital transformation in broad terms, but an inclusive future, technology is one of the biggest enablers. Imagine tools that support dyslexic thinkers, caption speech automatically, reduce administrative load, translate in real time, adjust for sensory sensitivities, and remove the need for constant self-advocacy. Technology becomes something that widens access instead of tightening it. Number 4, culture. Culture moves from psychological safety to genuine psychological freedom. Many workplaces still expect people to hide part of themselves, to mask, to minimize, to keep quiet, to not make it a big deal. In a reimagined workplace, people don't have to perform acceptance to survive. Leaders create environments where people can disclose without fear. Difference is not something to manage. Lived experiences are respected, and nobody feels they have to shrink themselves to fit in. It's a shift from you are safe here to you belong here. Number 5, leadership evolves and matures. In this future, leadership isn't only about KPIs or strategy decks. It's about how leaders show up in the room. Reflective instead of defensive. Curious instead of threatened. Aware of their impact, open to correction, and willing to redesign systems that serve everyone. Leadership becomes less about authority and more about accountability for the culture they create. Number 6, systems become inclusive by design. The biggest change is this: inclusion no longer depends on individual goodwill. It becomes a system. Recruitment, performance management, budgeting, promotion pathways, workplace design, procurement, digital transformation, learning and development, all of these become aligned around inclusion. When systems are aligned, people don't have to negotiate for their place. The organization simply works better for more people. So what could be? Summarized, a workplace where people aren't accommodated at the fringes, but instead included at the center. Systems are designed for reality, not for an outdated idea of an average employee. Power is shared in meaningful ways. Participation is enabled through design, not left to lack. Technology opens doors instead of closing them. And leadership is measured not just by outputs, but by the culture and possibility it creates. A workplace where people with disabilities across all identities and conditions can show up without apology, contribute without restriction, and lead without having to fight for legitimacy. This is not a dream, it's a design choice, and it is within reach if we choose to build it. So what's my call to action? As we move into the panel discussions, I want to leave you with a set of commitments and questions, not as tasks for later, but as lenses for how we engage with the rest of today. Because systems don't shift on their own. People, you, me, we shift systems. And it starts with how we listen, how we notice, and how we make sense of what we hear. Number 1, shift your lens. Throughout today, listen to disability narratives not as stories of deficit or limitation, but as stories that expand leadership, strategy, creativity, and design. Hold this question. What changes when I treat disability as a leadership lens? 2, audit your power quietly, internally. As speakers share their experiences, notice your instinctive reactions. Ask yourself, who am I instinctively believing? Who do I expect to justify themselves more? Whose needs have I normalized and whose have I never considered? This internal audit is where inclusive leadership begins. 3, listen for the systems behind the stories. Every experience you hear today is connected to design. Recruitment, performance systems, digital platforms, culture, sensory environments, leadership norms, etc. Ask yourself, what would need to change systemically for this person's story to be different? What part can I play in that? 4, stop designing for the average. As the speakers talk about their work and lives, let it challenge the idea that there is a single, typical way of working, thinking, speaking, sensing, or being productive. Ask yourself, if the average doesn't exist, who are systems really built for? Number 5, center lived experience. This symposium is not just content. It's expertise, it's leadership, it's lived experience shaping organizational redesign. Ask yourself, what would it look like if the people speaking today were at the table when we design policies, systems, and futures? Number 6, notice small actions that shift culture. As you listen, notice the small invitations that live in each story. A change in how meetings are run, a question asked differently, a small accommodation, a shift in tone, a compassionate assumption, a barrier removed. These actions may feel small, but they are how systems begin to move. In closing, disability is not on the margins of humanity. It is central to the human experience. Inclusion is not for them, it's for all of us. When we design inclusive systems, we build a better world. See differently, lead differently, act deliberately. You're not here just as spectators, but also here as architects of inclusive futures. Let us commit today to making the invisible visible. Thank you.